SpaceX has dominated tech news for years now. However, their space program isn't the only thing that's been making headlines. Plans for their Starlink satellite internet service are constantly being amended, and as a result of a recent filing to change their operational orbit range, they'd found themselves locked in a legal battle with other service providers, a battle they've now won. We'll be covering that and more in today's video. First up, battle with Viasat and Dish. SpaceX has been changing the landscape for space exploration since its conception back in 2002. Before SpaceX, space was a frontier limited to the governments of the world's superpowers, but they took the first step to making it possible for private companies to carve out a piece of that endless pie themselves. But that's not all they're doing. SpaceX's Starlink broadband internet service looks to provide low-latency internet to remote areas across the globe, something traditional service providers aren't able to do. The thing is, to do that consistently, they need to have a robust network of satellites, called constellations, always overhead of those areas. In order to set that up, the company needed to acquire permission from the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Luckily for them, they managed to secure it. Then, last year, they received additional permissions to operate at a lower orbit range of 540 to 570 kilometers above sea level. That's about half of their initial operational range. Dish Network and Viasat, both American communications companies, found this disagreeable as they suggested that their own satellites would be put at risk. They subsequently filed lawsuits to reverse the FCC's decision. Unfortunately for them, a decision was made regarding those suits recently, and it wasn't in their favor. The court said that the company's claims lacked merit or standing, upholding the FCC's original decision. Next, concerns and court denial. When SpaceX first filed their request for amendments to their operational range, several rival satellite operators were quick to argue against the FCC allowing it to happen. The main concern was that Starlink satellites would cause major radio interference with their own satellites. However, despite those objections, the FCC went ahead and granted SpaceX's request. That led to Viasat and Dish Network filing their lawsuits. During the legal proceedings, Dish argued that the FCC failed to properly consider how Starlink satellites would affect their own. In fact, they went so far as to say that the organization flat out refused to take into account reports constructed by outside experts. But it seemed that wasn't enough to sway the judges, who deemed the procedures followed by the FCC to be adequate. Those investigations determined that the risk of interference was minimal enough to allow Starlink to go forward. The judge's ruling also noted that Dish Network representatives themselves acknowledged that the changes suggested by SpaceX passed the FCC's procedures. Thirdly, Viasat's appeal. Viasat's approach to the legal battle was a little bit different. They argued that the FCC should have conducted an environmental review before allowing SpaceX their desired changes to operational range. On top of that, they also said that there was a risk of Starlink satellites colliding with their own, adding to the risk of environmental damage as well as damage to their property. The judges found that statement to hold no water, as they noted that the company only operates a single satellite in close proximity to the proposed Starlink constellation. Even that is a reach, with them saying that the probability of collision isn't high enough to warrant what's known as an Article 3 standing, which is the lawsuit being filed. Such potential for injury was deemed too speculative to bar SpaceX from obtaining permission for low Earth orbit, or LEO, range. Now, Viasat and Dish respond. The two companies were understandably not happy with the decision of the courts, and both made public statements regarding it soon after it went public. Viasat released a statement through their official channel, calling the court's decision a setback for space safety and environmental protection, still maintaining that the primary concern was the negative impact a collision could have on the environment. The statement suggested that Viasat was more concerned over the long-term effects that these decisions could have, rather than any losses incurred in the present. They were hoping that the court could force the FCC to more deeply consider the issues that could arise with launching mega constellations in LEO. Unfortunately, things didn't work out that way, and Viasat believes that the harmful impacts of their decision could persist for decades or even centuries, when these problems could have easily been avoided in the present. Dish TV's response was a little more positive. Speaking with PC Mag, they chose to focus on the rules still in place that protect their service. Specifically, they said that the ruling doesn't change the FCC's rule that prohibits NGSO operators from interfering with the television services provided by direct broadcast satellite operators, which includes Dish Network. Their statement came with a promise that they will remain vigilant and ensure that SpaceX operations don't ruin the customer experience. This isn't the first time that these companies have butted heads with the FCC over SpaceX's presence in orbit, and it certainly won't be the last. Lastly, LEO benefits. So why was SpaceX looking to change their operational range to LEO in the first place? Well, it's quite simple. Being closer to the Earth's surface means that you'd reduce the time it takes for data to travel between the satellites and systems on the ground. This is known as latency, and at GEO, which is where the majority of satellites are positioned, the latency is around 477 milliseconds, give or take some tens of milliseconds. Moving from GEO to LEO reduces that huge latency down to less than 27 milliseconds, which is necessary necessary for all the services that we're used to, like high-definition conference calling, multiplayer video games, or remote machine operation. Even basic services like voice calls would benefit from lower latency. Already, Starlink has partnered up with Microsoft to connect their cloud services to Starlink infrastructure, which wouldn't have been feasible had they still been operating at higher orbits. Other news. First, Starlink partners with T-Mobile. Earlier in August, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk and T-Mobile head Mike Seibert jointly announced a partnership between the two companies. That partnership will lead to virtually complete cell service coverage of the entirety of the United States. Initially, the service provided by the partnership will allow subscribers to send text messages from anywhere that has a clear line of sight of the sky. They'll then move on to expanding the service to include voice calls and data connections. This partnership has the potential to save lives, claims Seibert. There are many situations where people might require a phone connection, but service might be down due to failing cell towers or things like that. Starlink satellites could serve as an alternative in those situations. This all depends on Starlink's new satellites, which have been deployed to LEO. This new iteration has the required tech to make communication with cell phones possible. Again, this is still in its initial phases, so cell zones will only have 2 to 4 Mbps bandwidth, which is of course shared between subscribers. That's not a lot, but it's enough to send emergency texts. Next, Starlink global outage. On the 30th of August, Starlink users around the globe complained about the service being down. Thomas Ricker of The Verge reported his own experience of the outage, saying that his service in the Netherlands had gone out for about 30 minutes before returning. However, even then his system was reporting degraded service. Users from countries around the world like Mexico, the UK, and New Zealand all reported services going down at around the same time, suggesting a wide-scale system crash. Even after a day of waiting, many are still reporting degraded service on their systems. According to the Starlink app, SpaceX was investigating the outage. The service failure only strengthens the stance taken by many that cautioned against adopting Starlink early on. Coverage is currently poor, leaving many areas without a connection for long periods, and maintenance is made difficult owing to its orbital setup. Lastly, FCC Commissioner on SpaceX award reversal. Back in 2020, the FCC had awarded SpaceX around $885 million in subsidies as part of a plan to bring Starlink services to rural areas in the United States. However, that award was rescinded earlier in August, as well as an award to LTD Broadband that amounted to $1.2 billion. This was done as part of a new award under the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program to more than 300 bidders that amounted to around $9 billion. Brendan Carr, a senior Republican member of the FCC, criticized the decision. He said that the decision to reverse course vaporized their commitment to serve those rural areas and individuals that didn't have access to broadband services. He concluded by saying that it leaves those families on the wrong side of the digital divide when the technology is clearly present to give them high-speed service. One of the FCC's reasons for rescinding the award was that the technology is risky, but Carr said that those claims are unfounded. That's a wrap for this video. Was the decision to deny Viasat and Dish's appeals appropriate? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.